I think we're ready to get started. Good evening. Welcome to the University of Louisville's 14th annual and first ever virtual Anne Braden Memorial Lecture. My name is Cherie Dawson-Edwards, Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I bring you greetings from the University of Louisville's College of Arts and Sciences. Today's lecture comes at a time and in a space where dismantling oppressive and racist systems is simply not an option. We have to do it. Here in Louisville, we are still reeling from the murder of Breonna Taylor and the ongoing willful denial by some in our community that longstanding systems of oppression exist and result in tragedies such as this. Many of us are finding ourselves at odds with friends, family members, coworkers, and neighbors about what just boils down to human rights. A pandemic, protests, and a polarizing presidential election just seems like it's too much. Every time 2020 brings one thing that we think it just can't get any worse, it just absolutely does. It's a lot to handle, and many of us, at least I feel this way, are not doing such a great job at it sometimes. Many don't know how to productively discuss these critical issues we're facing, so we don't, or we do so in an unproductive manner. In this ongoing fight for racial justice, we all are going to make mistakes, but we have to continue on this journey together. I am hopeful that tonight's lecture will do as so many have done before and provide a healing balm to our community and country that has suffered so immensely this year. Before we hear from our special guest lecturer tonight, we will hear first from two of our students and from the director of the Anne Braden Institute, Kate Fossil, who is also a professor in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and who will introduce the speaker and monitor the Q&A. All questions can be submitted through the chat, which will be monitored throughout the lecture. Up next, with a short reading that sets the tone for tonight's event, are the ABI's two phenomenal graduate assistants. Jessica Young is a first-year doctoral student in the Department of Pan-African Studies, and Megan Boyette is a final year doctoral student in the Department of English. They will be reading a selection from The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action by Black lesbian mother, warrior, poet, Audre Lorde. Thank you.
Each of us is here now because in one way or another, we share a commitment to language and to the power of language and to the reclaiming of that language, which has been made to work against us. In the transformation of silence into language and action, it is vitally necessary for each one of us to establish or examine her function in that transformation and recognize her role as vital within that transformation. For those of us who write, it is necessary to scrutinize not only the truth of what we speak, but the truth of that language by which we speak it. For others, it is to share and spread also those words that are meaningful to us.
But primarily for us all, it is necessary to teach by living and speaking those truths which we believe and know beyond understanding. Because in this way alone, we can survive, by taking part in a process of life that is creative and continuing, that is growth. And it is never without fear of visibility, of the harsh light of scrutiny, and perhaps judgment, of pain, of death. But we have lived through all of those already in silence, except death. And I remind myself all the time now that if I were to have been born mute or had maintained an oath of silence my whole life long for safety, I would still have suffered and I would still die. It is very good for establishing perspective.
Hello, good evening. I'm Kate Fossil, and I'm the director of the University of Louisville Anne Braden Institute for Social Justice Research, as you heard. Thanks so much to our wonderful students. I see Megan had a little video problem, so you didn't get to see her lovely face, but Thanks to both of you for that powerful reading. And thanks so much to the Departments of Pan-African Studies and the Department of English for assigning us these students. Thank you, Cherie, for the warm welcome. I too would like to welcome all of you here tonight. I was sad at first to think this lecture wasn't going to be in real life, because for me personally, it's always so gratifying to stand up here, there, and greet everyone in person, to see such a range of people, from old friends of Anne Braden's to next to young students who have only just learned of the power and the history of the fight against racism. But being here on the camera, it's still lovely to be with all of you and to have you here. And I think tonight it's special because we actually have a national audience tonight. So that's a cool feature of being virtual. So amid the tensions we're all living with here in 2020, thanks for spending your evening with us here in Louisville, where the name Breonna Taylor inspires us to keep pushing for justice for Breonna Taylor and others like her, all of us. I want to also speak about the background that you see to my video here. These buttons come from Anne Braden's collection of buttons, and they date back through the 80s. I don't know how much you can read them, but I thought that would be a nice little touch of history to add to tonight's virtual talk. I want to first thank a few special people. First of all, I want to thank those of you who supported this event as friends of the 2020 Anne Braden Memorial Lecture. Those of you who came into the Zoom room saw the image thanking everyone who is a friend of the lecture, and I want to thank them again right out loud. Many of you have been with us year after year, and we appreciate it. We are dedicated to keeping this lecture going, to keeping it free and open to the public, and we could not do that without your support. So thank you, thank you. Thank you too to the U of L College of Arts and Sciences, which has kept on supporting the ABI even through some very tough budget years, including the one we're in now. Thanks to all who helped make this event possible. Thank you to Andrea Radmaker, who's our stage manager, our tech manager. Thanks to the interpreters, and thanks to the Muhammad Ali Institute, our partner, who makes this event part of their annual Peace and Justice Week. And thank you to the larger campus and community network who've supported us this year and every year. I want to say a word about funding, because it is many of you wrote to me to ask if there was a fee for tonight's lecture, and there isn't. There never has been. But instead of collecting donations as people exit, as we sometimes do, I'd like to encourage anyone who wants to give to support this kind of work to make a donation tonight to SisterSong, the Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective that Loretta Ross co-founded. There was a card that ran across the welcome screen on how to give, and you'll see it again after the talk is complete. So please consider opening your wallets to make a gift, however small, to underscore the importance of reproductive justice to racial justice. That, by the way, is the topic of our Research Meets Activism morning panel, ordinarily a breakfast, with Loretta Ross and a group of local activists tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. If you like what you hear tonight, please register and attend. And again, there's a card telling you how that you'll see after the lecture on the screen. Well, a personal note really quickly before I introduce the speaker. Some of you know that this is my last lecture as director of the Anne Braden Institute. I won't be stepping away from the ABI entirely, but I will be stepping down as director at the end of this school year in June. And I'll become like an ordinary, although a part-time professor again. So I just also want to take this moment to say to all of you, what a pleasure, and really, truly, what an honor it has been to do this work with you. Thank you for your incredible support, and I'm excited to see the next person take this institute, which was nothing at all this time 15 years ago, from all it is today to all it can become tomorrow. It's not an iconic institute, but it does help keep Anne Braden's important message alive that the fight against white supremacy is white people's responsibility too. We created the problem and it's up to us to solve it, to help solve it. So thank you, Anne Braden. Today is, as you know, Veterans Day. And there are many kinds of veterans. So today we're going to salute the veterans in the struggle for peace and justice, those who keep on keeping on. One such person is the reason we're all gathered here. I'm extremely proud to be able to introduce to you our speaker tonight. Loretta Ross is a name long known to many of us in the feminist anti-racist movement because she truly is one of the founders of the movement against violence against women. In her nearly 5 decades of work, Loretta was an early adopter. She was a pioneer, really, in what we know today as intersectionality. She's a foundational voice in why the feminist movement is more inclusive today than it was when she first got involved with it in the early 1970s. She was instrumental in the DC Rape Crisis Center, the National Anti-Klan Network, where she worked closely with co-founder Anne Braden, and too many other groups to name here, including SisterSong, which, as I mentioned, she co-founded. Today, she is a professor at Smith College in the program for the study of gender and joins us from her home in Atlanta. I'm pleased to say also that this is Loretta's second visit to the Anne Braden Institute. So let me also give a shout out to the Social Justice Sisters. I know some of you are out there. That's a local group of us who brought Loretta here for a series of community conversations on reproductive justice way back in 2008. So with that, I welcome scholar activist extraordinaire Loretta Ross back to Louisville, and I proudly turn over the mic to hear her truth telling. As you listen, you can post questions in the chat, which we will distill and Loretta will take at the end of the talk. Also, the last thing I want to say is that you may be aware, but the lecture is being recorded and will be available later to rewatch or to share on the ABI Facebook page. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Anne. Well, Kate, I'm sorry. I've got Anne in my brain so much, I almost lost the thread of who I was talking to. It's a joy to be able to reconnect with the Louisville community, particularly from Atlanta, because right now we're in the center of great social change taking place, particularly with the way Black women showed up to help elect President-elect Biden, and how we're continuing to do the work so that we can help gain control of the Senate so that we can actually get an agenda through that's dedicated to human rights, peace, and justice, something that President Obama was thwarted in because Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, who I wish you had gotten rid of, is still trying to keep any Democratic president from actually achieving any goals while they continue to deconstruct democracy in our country. And so it's very exciting to be in Atlanta right now. And I think it's something prophetic that I'm also talking to people in Kentucky and say that really, if you build the ground game that we've got, you can also turn your state blue. Now I'm going to try to load my PowerPoint deck and make sure that I do it right because I don't always get that right. I hope that you can see it. I'm hoping that you can see it. Somebody I'm sure will shout out to me if you can't. As I said, my name is Loretta Ross. My brand is Dread Feminist. In many ways, I'm an accidental feminist, but first let me talk about my history with Anne Braden. The National Anti-Klan Network was founded in 1979 by Reverend C.T. Vivian, who passed this year, the same day John Lewis passed, and Anne Braden, of course, who unfortunately died in 2006. And in 1990, I was hired at the National Anti-Klan Network, which had renamed itself the Center for Democratic Renewal. So I had a chance and the joy to work closely with Ann, with Reverend C.T. Vivian, and even with Ben Chavis, who's the young fellow in the middle who went on to become the president of the NAACP. And so all of these influences on my life and my activism shaped who I am today. As a matter of fact, I need to call in Reverend Vivian and Ann, because when we were doing this monitoring of hate groups across the country in the early 1990s, Reverend Vivian came to the staff one day and simply said, if you ask people to give up hate, then you have to be there for them when they do. And I have to honestly say that was not a message I wanted to hear, because I was very comfortable hating people in the Klan and the Nazis and the militia movement because they hated me. And I felt that that was only fair. But when Reverend Vivian told us that, and he was seconded by people like Ann and Ben Chavis and Reverend Mac Jones and all the leaders of CDR that too numerous to mention, he really started a chain of thinking in my brain about how we really cannot use the master's tools, as Audre Lorde says, to build a movement for human rights. In other words, we can't violate people's human rights in the process of obtaining human rights. And so that led me to work with Danny Levitas and Leonard Zeskin to participate in deprogramming people who've been in the hate movement. And I learned not only a lot about people who joined hate movements, and I had to take their suffering seriously that led them into that path, but I learned a lot about myself, that I had to deepen my capacity for forgiveness, for love, for self-love, that made it possible for me to even offer forgiveness and love to others. And so Reverend Vivian is why I started on this path that I'm going to talk about tonight, called Calling In the Calling Out Culture. I love the fact that y'all also started with a poem by Audre Lorde. I was lucky enough to know Audre. I met her a couple of times, and I was really blessed because she gave me my very first check when I wanted to go to Africa in 1984. And she believed in me. She believed in Black feminism. And she was one of those people whose shoulders we all stand on. And she also wrote this phrase called a burst of light, that inescapable knowledge that's deep in the bone of my physical limitation. And I'm certainly physically and mentally limited. But I consider this calling in message that I'm trying to offer that inescapable knowledge that I now have, because this recent election has confirmed some of my worst fears, that this country is tipping towards outright fascism, and the Civil War never really ended. We're just seeing different manifestations of it play out as we debate whether we're going to be a land of equality and freedom or whether we're going to be a land of oppression and repression, as we have this soft coup taking place in real life. And I think we all have to recognize the magnitude of the challenge that is facing us, and calling each other in instead of calling each other out, I think is vital for us to help heal the planet by healing our relationships with each other. We need to heal with our families. We need to heal with our friends. We need to heal even with strangers and even some of those Trump supporters, which is a hard lesson to hear, I'm sure. But like Reverend Vivian said, I had to learn to see the Klan as human beings, and we're going to have to learn to see some of the Trump supporters as human beings. I'm not saying all of them, because some of them just want to exterminate us, and they are not the ones that I'm talking about. But there are those who, through their pain, they've been led to listen to a charlatan and a con man. And we just have to keep in mind when we didn't know what we know and offer that grace. And I'm going to be talking about grace in my presentation later on. I've also mentioned that I do this work because I'm part of an emerging US-based human rights movement. And this is not something recent. The first time the phrase human rights was used by an activist in the United States was in 1858 when Frederick Douglass proclaimed that the lynching of a Black man in New York City was a human rights violation. And while this isn't a presentation on human rights, I believe that we need calling in practices so that me, as a member of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement, learns to work with the indigenous rights movement, the economic justice, the trans justice, the uh, environmental justice, disability rights, on and on movements. I don't have enough space to put all the circles that I can imagine on this page, but I want you to understand that when we decide that we're going to share a human rights analysis and ideology, then we're going to have to learn techniques to work with people who don't precisely think like us. Because I might privilege women's rights, and I need to work with someone who privileges economic justice and someone else who privileges trans rights and identity rights. And we don't need to be calling each other out simply because we're not clones of each other or sharing the same ideology perfectly. But if we all believe in human rights, then we're going to have to do our work in a way that doesn't violate people's human rights. And that's where learning calling in techniques count. So I probably shouldn't even have to define what is calling out because we're really, really good at criticizing other people. But basically, for those who say, well, what is this new term? Because I hadn't heard of it until young people started telling me about it about 5 years ago because they were much more involved in social media than I am, that it's about criticizing the way other people do their social justice work. But I find that as I've observed it, these people who are so hyped on being critical of each other's practices usually don't practice what we used to do in the 70s and 80s, the practice of self-criticism, so that we could make sure that our laundry was clean before we started talking about someone else's dirty linens. And that is largely missing from the call out culture right now. It's almost like a woke competition. And unfortunately, the people on the right have weaponized the call out culture as if they're the victims of it. But we're not going to let them hijack our own burst of light knowledge about how we need to work together. Because when the right uses the whole framework of calling out, they're really trying to suppress us in very dangerous ways, like attacking liberal education, deconstructing democracy. I could go on. This ain't that speech. My course that I teach at Smith College is called White Supremacy in the Age of Trump. So it keeps bleeding over into every talk that I have because of the urgency of the moment. I also find that we're teaching a lot of young people radical information and radical knowledge, but we're not giving them the radical humility in order to use this knowledge responsibly. And so I see a lot of times people weaponize a phrase that they just learned recently and then sneer at people who don't know what they know. And as I say, it's called part of the woke competition. And with this radical knowledge goes a radical responsibility. And I hope we can understand the concept of radical love, which I'll talk about more later. And so, of course, we want to banish people because they're not woke enough. And I see misuses of the call out culture where people want to boost their ego or, you know, virtue signal in the community, boost their standing. And we spend entirely too much time seeking political purity in our opinions, and we shame and we bully people. And I have to ask the question, how is that different from the very same prison industrial complex that we're already criticizing? Because they use shaming, they use bullying, they use excommunication, they use basically incarceration, and we're using these same tactics. And so it becomes a public performance for visibility. And we end up using rigid binaries like good, black, bad, black, white, cis, trans, straight, gay, immigrant, citizen. And we see these things as natural and not socially constructed and defined and maintained. And a lot of times call outs create interruptions that are very disruptive. Now, I'm an activist who comes from the 70s And I was active in the 60s, but I was in the early 70s. And at the time, the FBI ran a program called COINTELPRO, a counterintelligence program, where they infiltrated, and monitored all organizations on the left, whether it was the American Indian movement, the Black Panther movement, the women's rights movement, the anti-war movement. All of these movements were monitored and disrupted by the FBI. Sometimes they just used gossip and character assassination. Sometimes they actually ended up harming and imprisoning a number of people. So, what I think people don't realize is that if you're sufficiently disruptive in a social justice setting where we're trying to uh, fight oppression and you end up being totally disruptive and not collaborative in these settings because you think you know something or you're smarter or you're more woke than everybody else, people will not see you possibly as interrogating the process. Instead, some of us who are more skeptical might start asking the question whether or not you are here to intentionally disrupt us. And so do not perceive calling out as the righteous, the self-righteous political activism that is characterized on the internet, because some of us see disruption with a much more ominous eye than just naivete. And I just need to say that. Of course, all kinds of calling out is necessary. We have to challenge mansplaining, whitesplaining, blacksplaining. I mean, we really have to challenge oppression. So calling out is not a pass, calling in is not a pass to oppression, but it's choosing another way to deal with it. A lot of calling out is preemptive. Let me get them before they get me. And sometimes it challenges the love and attention given to others as if we're in an attention competition. And often it transforms one story into something different that may or may not be true. And this creates a very toxic atmosphere in our social justice human rights work because it does replicate the carceral system of punishment. It creates a discouraging atmosphere for people. Why would anybody want to come to a movement that makes them feel worse than before they joined the movement? We have to fill people with joy in doing this righteous work, not fear and walking around on eggshells for fear that they'll say the wrong things and get harshly criticized for it. And so, unfortunately, calling out frightens a lot of people into not speaking up to tell their truth. And then we gaslight them when they tell their truth if their truth doesn't fit a narrative that we support or that affirms us, which is kind of a waste of time and very non strategic. I think it drives people away from the movement, and in a way, it disguises privilege while it weaponizes language, because it is a privilege to even know this language that we often use. I think one of the more damaging parts of it, though, is that it makes accountability different. Because why would anybody own up to or admit that they've made a mistake if the reaction to at that admission is a severe calling out and an exiling, a criticizing, I mean, a really an attack on their humanity by people who make their own mistakes. And so maybe it's preemptive because if I call you out, maybe you won't know that am capable of making mistakes too. And it does devalue people's lived experiences, isolates people. And I think possibly the most damaging thing is that it makes our movement, and particularly new people in our movement, cynical and feel hopeless, that there's nothing they can do. Obviously, calling out is not a new practice. I began my activism in 1970. And so I was lucky enough to do it in Washington, D.C., where I met this woman named Jo Freeman, who now calls herself Joreen. But she wrote this article in 1976 called Trashing, the Dark Side of Sisterhood. And you can see she wrote this long before we had the term calling out. Trashing is a particularly vicious form of character assassination, and it amounts to psychological rape. It's manipulative, dishonest, and excessive. It's occasionally disguised by the rhetoric of honest conflict or covering up that any disapproval exists at all. But it's not done to expose disagreements or resolve differences. It's done to disparage and destroy. And so it ends up that trashing is done behind people's back. It can be done privately or in a group situation. Uh, it could be through ostracism or just open denunciation. And the trasher may give you false reports of what horrible things others think of you. Oh, I don't think this, but that others have said this about you. And they can tell your friends false stories of what you think of them. And it really creates a situation where everything you say gets interpreted in the most negative light. Often, like many abusers, they project their behaviors onto you. And of course, we're led by a malignant narcissist who does that quite well by projecting his faults onto everyone else. And when they project these unrealistic expectations on others, then you can become a legitimate target for anger, legitimate as they see it anyway. And they deny your perception of reality. They pretend you don't exist or that you don't matter. And she's talking about how the overstatement of harm is used to justify the cruelty through exaggeration of harm that then justifies retaliatory abuse. And when you indulge in dehumanizing someone else, it doesn't feel like abuse because the people who are doing it often feel like they're punching up, attacking people who should be held accountable. Yet we have to admit that calling out or canceling rarely leads to accountability. And she goes on to say, another quote from this essay that I'll read: this attack is accomplished by making you feel that your very existence is inimical to the movement and that nothing can change this short of ceasing to exist. These feelings are reinforced when you're isolated from your friends as they become convinced that their association with you is similarly inimical to the movement and to themselves. Any support of you will taint them. Eventually, all your colleagues join in a chorus of condemnation, which cannot be silenced, and you are reduced to a mere parody of your previous self. Nowadays, we call that Twitter jail, where 104 characters can change your life forever. It's a form of incarceration, not by the state, but by your former friends who join a crusade against you. I hope this does not sound familiar to you, but unfortunately, it is so pervasive. I think we all have either participated in a call out culture or been the target of it, or both. In doing research for my book that I've written on calling in the calling out culture, I ran across this wonderful trans writer called Natalie Wynn. And Natalie writes a really strong analysis of the 7 steps of calling out culture and the cancel culture. And in it, she talks about, first of all, there's a presumption of guilt instead of a presumption of innocence. And no justice is really possible because the rush to judgment allows no fair assessment of facts, and it encourages scandals to grow. People get titillated by the scandals, and in a way, they sadistically enjoy each other's downfalls. The second stage is abstraction, not actually providing any details that's going to affect the bad narrative or change or challenge the bad narrative that's going around about a person. And so when no details are provided, then you can't verify any facts, can you? And they use innuendo instead of declarative facts that can be challenged. And they'll throw words around like, so that listeners assign their own meanings to these words, kind of like toxic and manipulative and harmful. And this allows a quick slide into talking about people's behavior. You move from talking about their behaviors into now talking about their characters or their morality. And unfortunately, the targets of such abstract accusations are damned if they do and they're damned if they don't respond. Because leaving the accusation hanging makes people speculate much worse about what happened than if they actually knew the truth of what the person is being accused of. And it's also used to invalidate claims of identity and shared interests with the critics. When I was exploring Natalie's work, she astonished me by how many subcultures and excuses for dividing each other exist in the trans community. I mean, they had words for who's had surgery, who hasn't had surgery, who's out, who's not. I mean, it was just really deep. I couldn't even keep up with the ways that a a very endangered community that is leading statistics and hate crimes tends to spend a whole lot of time calling each other out as if they can't focus collectively on the existential threat that they're actually experiencing. The third step is essentialism, when you move from critiquing the bad behaviors to calling people poisonous, harmful, dangerous, manipulative. This is a character assassination, which then gets inflated and escalated. And this completes the shift from challenging ideas to making accusations about people's authenticity, like they're faking their identity, they're faking their consciousness. They really don't know what they're talking about. They're just doing this to get money or attention. Uh, they don't earn any approval or support that they received now or in the past. And I really don't have time to talk about biological essentialism as practiced by the white supremacy movement, but really it is a form of essentialism that those on the left who should know better do. I think the thing that most aggravates me, though, is the pseudo moralism or intellectualism, the pseudo intellectualism, because it lacks moral or intellectual rigor. It's a lack of sincerity. It's really hypocrisy in many ways in the cause of being self righteous. They, they actually replicate what they're then critiquing, what they're calling out. I call it the politics of denunciation. I had a personal experience with this. I won't try to get into it too much, but one time the ADL called me when I was working at the Center for Democratic Renewal, asking me to denounce some other Black people because they read them as being anti Semitic. I actually do think the Black people they were calling out were associated with Farrakhan and they were anti Semitic. But as I told this person on the call from the ADL, that we didn't even denounce the Klan, keeping Reverend Vivian's message in my mind. And I, as a Black woman, was not going around the country denouncing other Black people. That wasn't my mission. And this caller from the ADL basically tried to call me out and threaten me by saying, well, if you don't denounce them, well, you risk being called anti Semitic yourself. And I just beat him back and I said, I'm sorry, I'm not your Negro, inadvertently quoting James Baldwin. But I said, I am one of the leading Black female experts on anti Semitism in America. And if you're going to accuse me of anti Semitism, you better bring a big gun. Because that was just so rude of them to think that I was going to be their beck and call girl because we all worked on the same side. And then I questioned whether we were all on the same side when the tools of denunciation was the was the choice he was making as he made a false equivalence between Black anti-Semites and the fascist anti-Semites I thought we were both working against. But moving right along, I see a lot of people use a lot of pseudo moralism, and they also try to leverage into these conversations somebody else's pain as their moral cloak. Like every time I have a conversation with a largely white group around white supremacy, almost inevitably someone will pull up, well, what about the, and you can fill in the blank. And they're using these other people, other identities, often of people not present, as a cloak to disguise their discomfort with being accountable for white supremacy. So I really do have a problem with this pseudo um, moralism and intellectualism. It also creates a cult of unforgivability. No matter how sincere the apology is made, it's always going to be seen as insincere. It demands that people apologize quickly, thoroughly, and completely according to whatever subjective needs of the person denouncing the harm. But at the same time, no matter how well they do it and how quickly they do it, they will still be read as being fakes. And what this actually produces is an increase in insincere apologies offered to insincere critics, because all apologies are seen as manipulative attempts to continue the harm and ignore the hurt. If you stay silent, however, don't apologize, then you're accused of fleeing the accountability process altogether, because no benefit of the doubt is offered. And particularly problematic is the weaponizing of a marginalized status, claiming that because a person is X, they have the right to appoint themselves as judges of another person's growth or lack thereof. And then there's an infectiousness about the call out culture. I call it the political contamination spiral, guilt by association. Because if you associate with in any way with someone being called out, as Natalie analyzes, if you're even in the same conversation with someone who's already been canceled, you risk being canceled or deplatformed in this guilt by association. And it's like the person A had a political conversation with the person B, and the person C now disassociates from B and A because of guilt by association. I'm writing a book on the call out culture, and I've got over 400 footnotes and references in my book. And I fully expect that I will be called out because somebody's going to disagree with something that somebody I use as a site in my book has said. I've already experienced this briefly because I co-signed a letter in Harper's Magazine criticizing the call out culture. And because other signatories on that letter, people had problems with them, including J.K. Rowling, the writer of Harry Potter. Then I got criticized for criticizing the call out culture with no sense of irony. People didn't understand what they were doing. And they claimed that we who signed the letter were providing convenient cover for rich people who didn't want to be held accountable for their words. I mean, really, people, do some homework. I think what was the word? Do more research and less me search before you accuse people of things that when you don't even know anything about them. Anyway, moving right along. And of course, call out culture uses these false dualism, false binaries of gay, straight, evil, good, in, out, woke, unwoke, going on. I think one of the things that drives the call out culture is something I call toxic perfectionism, where, it's actually alienates people, of course, with the pursuit of political purity or political correctness, because we want to judge people whose beliefs differ from ours. And again, that cloaking yourself as somebody else's pain by being their advocate is really part of the savior complex. And instead of helping people find their own voices and perspectives, you want to represent them or save them. And of course, the prison industrial complex is replicated. And it makes people really afraid, really fearful, because they believe that they'll be thrown under the bus if they say the wrong thing. And this whole down with the cause phrase, like we used in the 70s, is really just the oppression Olympics, being competitive with your wokeness. And it really eliminates the ability to listen to people with other viewpoints. And it's sometimes caused by us doing too much online engagement. Doom scrolling is called in these toxic communities. And really you end up sabotaging your own happiness because you're just a cauldron of anger and you're holding grudges with against a whole lot of sometimes even strangers because you've imagined that they've harmed you by choosing to be different than you are. And I think it's a choice when you choose to make the world crueler than it needs to be through toxic perfectionism. And again, there's a performative part to the outrage. And it's sad because the problem with toxic perfectionism is that you have no choice but to look down on yourself because you know you're not perfect. And so that's where a whole lot of self-doubt comes in, that lack of self-forgiveness comes in, and it's really very harmful. And many people spend their time, especially online, canceling with the best of them, screaming about how awful white people are, how awful cis men are, how awful conservatives are, how awful liberals are, how awful I mean, just on and on and on. How awful turfs are, moving right along. And it really reveals an in-group insecurity. And all I can do is hope they'll get to the point where they look at themselves and not stand what they've become because they've lost the joy in life and especially have lost their sense of humor quite frequently. And maybe it is possible, and I know I'm going to get in trouble saying this, it is possible to see a joke as funny, even if it is sexist or racist. Everything that is sexist or racist when you're swimming in a sea of sexism and racism will not kill you. So we've got to be a lot more pragmatic and a lot more honest with our wokeness and our values. I find a lot of people struggle with their identities and they feel justified in visiting hurt on other people because they hurt themselves. But people should be tired of walking around looking for a fight. I mean, that sounds like it's a very exhausting way to be in the world. And you know, that emotional edge of being always watchful, waiting to be hurt, really, really has to be one of the things I hope people consciously seek to resist. So I'm asking us to rethink calling out by avoiding the us versus them mentality, that you need to start by focusing on yourself and your motives. Prioritize your strategy. If your strategy is not to disrupt groups and blow them up, but to create unity, maybe calling out isn't your best strategy to achieve that goal. And really pay attention to your outcomes. Um, I was actually had one experience like in 1992 with this, where I was on the mountaintop in rural Tennessee because a group of women whose husbands were in the Klan had invited me up there to do an anti-racist training for them. And I was more than happy to go up there and do the training. And since it was 1992, I was a bit shocked when they kept calling me the nice little colored girl and they asked me if I would sing a Negro spiritual for them. Now, y'all hear the raspiness of my voice. You never want me to sing anything. And just because I look like Bernice Reagan doesn't mean I've got her voice. And it took me a minute to process what they were saying as the nice little colored girl who was going to sing a spiritual for them. And then I had to really assess why I was on that mountaintop to try to bring them into the 20th century with the appropriate language to refer to Black people, or to help them deal with the fact that their husbands and children were caught up in the Klan. And so I set aside my anger and my hurt so that I could fulfill my goal of doing this anti-racist training for women who were risking domestic violence or worse by even having me talk to them. Now, I have to honestly say, they invited me to stay on that mountaintop overnight, and I had enough self-preservation to get the hell off that mountaintop because I didn't know if they could keep the secret, that I had been there long enough for me to be safe. But still, you have to focus on what your motives are, your strategy is, so that you can choose whether you want to do a calling out or a calling in strategy and what outcomes you want. And it is important to build collaborations and to stop using shame and ousting as punishment because you should value the relationships that we're building rather than see them as transactional. And we've understood the importance of not having every relationship as transactional with the bad example set by President Trump. So let me pivot and talk about what is calling in. Calling in is really a calling out done with love. So you're still paying attention to the injury, to the harm, but instead of putting on somebody on full blast, you're saying, you know, that what you said didn't land well with me. Do you mind if we have coffee to go talk about it? Or, we don't use that word anymore. Sometimes we say it this way. Oh, I'm sorry that you misgendered me. Sometimes I misgender myself. Would you like to talk about how we can learn better ways of describing each other and using the proper gender pronoun? It's not about ignoring the harm, because a lot of people falsely assume that calling in is about ignoring the harm. No, it's choosing not to blow up somebody's life because they made a mistake. And this requires investing in each other, knowing that people are not disposable, and that if we are sufficiently healed ourselves, we can invest in another person's growth. Now, calling in is not for everybody. I have to honestly say there's different roles people play in calling in. If you are still in the midst of your hurt from the wounds of white supremacy or transphobia or patriarchy or whatever, then you're not in a place to really want to invest in somebody else's growth. And that's okay, because it's not an obligatory practice. It's a choice you make. It's okay to say, talk to the hand and walk away. But I think it's a different thing when you put somebody on blast simply because you're in a lot of pain, even because you're not really assessing whether the harm was intentional or not. It's also not an identity based practice, it's an opportunity to decide to self reflect, to see what kind of human being you want to be walking through the world, whether you're going to let the trauma that someone else has imposed upon you permanently define who you are in the world, or will you recapture your self definition, your self empowerment, and your power to actually forgive yourself, apologize, and repair for mistakes you make, and making intentional steps to change your behavior. You always have to remember the broader context, because if someone accidentally steps on your foot, it's different than if somebody slams their foot on your foot on purpose. And so putting somebody on blast because they accidentally stepped on your foot is kind of what the kids do when they're trying to get respect and make sure that nobody disses them and all of that. But emotional maturity should provide you with the capacity to do a more accurate threat assessment, to not just assume that because something hurt, it was intentional. And by the way, the worst hurt you'll feel probably will come from your family and your friends and your lovers anyway. And you can't just dispose of them as easily as you can a stranger. And that's why it's important to stay calm and ask for clarifications. Sometimes just saying, I beg your pardon to somebody makes them rewind what they said in their own head and say, wow, that didn't come out right. Let me further explain myself. And that requires active, loving, listening practices that are taught in many different settings, in therapeutic settings, in relationship building settings, all kinds of places you can learn to turn off the chatter in your own brain and your overreaction to other people's words so that you can pay careful attention to theirs. And you should be grateful that you have this opportunity to learn. And I think it's important for us who want to build a human rights movement to have difficult conversations in a culture of accountability. But we have to use practices of radical love. In other words, the love and the trust in humanity that we all want to be good people. We all want to do the right thing, even if we're pretty inept at doing it. I find that since I work at a predominantly white institution like Smith College, I find that I am surrounded by a bunch of white people who want to do the right thing, and most don't know how to do it right. And that doesn't mean that they're evil people, they're damaged people, or anything. But white supremacy intentionally keeps white people from understanding how to deconstruct it. So stop being surprised that that's the norm, and let's work on it, like I said. Um, I think we need these human rights based conversations where we establish inclusion and not exclusion as the norm. One of the things that frustrates me about the bad turn that identity politics has taken. Identity politics was a concept offered to the universe by the Combahee River Collective in 1977. And it was supposed to be used as a statement where you defined who you are. And then the second step, once you got through that self-definition, was to define who you would work with, who you needed to stand in solidarity with. But when I talk about the misuse of identity politics, I see too many people using their identities basically to define who everybody else ain't, as opposed to figuring out who they need to work with, because they're using it to justify not doing the hard work of working with anybody who's different from them, which is rather sad because it means that you will never gain power by only working with people who exactly resemble you. But moving right along, I think we have to stop seeing people through our trauma-informed lenses. I am a rape and incest survivor, but it would be very bad for me to see all men as my rapists just because I don't get along with a lot of guys. I mean, hell, we can argue on over football or tennis or pinochle, which I play competitively. That doesn't mean that I should feel threatened as if they were the same types of guys who violated me when I was a child. But if you don't get help for your trauma, then you end up with permanently attached trauma-informed lenses. So that somebody just speaking to you harshly or just debating with you over an issue triggers you back into those earlier feelings of helplessness, powerlessness, and harm. I find that people can invest a lot of money into processes and not outcomes, but we can also spend a lot of time in privileging outcomes over processes. For example, I see a lot of people justify doing horrible things to each other, claiming that the ends justify the means. But I also see a lot of people in social justice practices spending so much time on mindfulness processes that they never achieve anything but self-congratulatory feeling good outcomes. And so we're going to have to work on balance, I think, in order to gain the power we need to end white supremacist oppression. But we do not have to recreate oppressive spaces and replicate what we're trying to overthrow. And we really, like Tony K. Bambara says, we've got to make the revolution fun. We've got to make it a fun, informative place for people to come who want to join us as part of the human rights movement. When people are called in or out, they're going to feel almost like the same reaction, whether you call them in or you're calling them out, because they're going to feel defensive. They're going to get that sinking feeling in their stomach. They don't feel like they're really being seen as the way that they really are. And they may even feel torn apart by whether it's a calling in or a calling out. They'll feel shut down, that someone's mobbing them, or at least summoning a mob to mob them. Feeling angry and isolated, hurt and unheard is common. Feeling that people are dismissing your perspectives through a form of gaslighting, lighting or denying your perspective. Feeling a little numb, like, oh my God, I just said that, or they just said that about me. What did I do? And people usually retreat inward when that happens. And whatever past patterns you've developed mostly as a child for dealing with conflict, those will be the patterns that you often exhibit when someone is either calling you in with love or calling you out with anger, because we haven't learned to manage those past patterns in a more productive or constructive way. They'll deflect to other issues, attack other people's character or personality. That's the ad hominem attack. They'll counterattack, preemptively attack sometimes. And if you do it in a way, if you call people in a way that doesn't feel like you respect them, they'll double down on their intransigence. They're not going to just immediately leap to concluding that you're right. And that's one of the reasons we have so much trouble talking to Trump supporters, but that's a whole nother talk. A lot of times false equivalences are offered, like, well, let me just use America. Whenever we try to criticize the United States human rights record, the first thing our country will say, well, what about China? What about Cuba? That what aboutery thing. And, of course, we say, I don't live in China or Cuba. I'm talking about my responsibilities as a patriot in this country. But they don't want to hear that. A lot of times there's tears, particularly one of the things that's particularly irksome, I think, to a lot of Black women is white women's tears, but I'm also annoyed with Black women who don't realize the legitimacy of an emotional reaction that is just a reaction. You don't have to take responsibility for other people feeling in pain in that way, but you also can't be dismissive of it either. And then people sabotage and can feel outraged. And so I don't want it to sound like, okay, this is a bad thing, it's so dystopian, why should I try it? But I think we can actively work to to pull ourselves out of this moral pit that we've dug for ourselves as a human rights movement. I really do believe that we can do this. And because I spent a lot of time paying attention to the writings of my elders whose shoulders I'm standing on, I really think that we're good at we can be better at this. When I was director of the DC Rape Crisis Center in the 1970s, we had a program called Prisoners Against Rape, where we actually taught feminist theory to Black men who were incarcerated for raping and murdering Black women. And if we could do that kind of radical love work in the 1970s, I'm still interrogating why 50 years later we can't do it. We can't still do that. That if people have done some horrible thing, and most of the times the people we're calling in ain't done nothing nearly as atrocious, but we act like they have. So I'm again saying we can be better. And again, this is about how you need to recognize that time will slow down when you're shocked. We may get gaslighted. Some call outs are justified, by the way. I like vertical upward call outs where somebody who's unapproachable or unreachable, like President Trump is called out, or Mitch McConnell, or what have you, because they're not going to listen to anything but a call out. And there's a question of whether they listen then. But at the same time, I think most call outs that we use in the human rights movement are horizontal against each other. And so we need to recognize that there's a time when call outs are appropriate. So I'm not condemning all call outs, but I am condemning the misuse of them because how and when they occur matters. And we have to provide an opportunity for self-growth and reflection, because why call somebody out if you're not going to give them a chance to figure out what they did wrong and grow and reflect on it when you're using a culture of unforgivability? And we need to understand that effective apologies require taking responsibility for what you did, offering to remedy what harm you caused, and changing behavior. And as I said before, your discernment and threat assessments are very important. It's very hard to be honest, particularly when you want to focus on the difference between intent and impact, but you need to stop and remember how it feels when you're called out before you call somebody else out. I'm going to close because we're running out of time by skipping one of my slides to talk about the power of forgiveness. Mr. Singleton, who I'm quoting here, mother, who was Sharonda Coleman Singleton, who was murdered in the Charleston massacre by Dylann Roof 5 years ago. And in an interview, Mr. Singleton talked about this quote: "The narrative of forgiveness is submitting, and it means that you're weak, or people would think that. But I've realized that forgiving is so much tougher than holding a grudge. It takes a lot more courage to forgive than it does to say, I'm going to be upset about whatever forever." And so I want to analyze the power of forgiveness, how you turn extreme harm, and I'm talking about extreme harm, into grace, which of course raises the question, well, if you're talking about less than extreme harm, why can't you work on your forgiveness muscle? I think extreme harm moves way beyond racial reconciliation. White people always want Black people to quickly forgive every harm they do, as if we're not in the middle of an unending civil war. And this rush to forgiveness judgmentalism really denies people the right to be angry, to grieve, to process their harm. And in many ways, it's used to minimize the injury because it says, well, you really weren't harmed if you forget, if forgiveness is so hard for you. And then, of course, on the other hand, Black people say, well, we offer forgiveness too quickly. And so we should still hold a grudge and be angry. And either way, it ends up de-victimizing the victims as if they did not suffer that grievous harm. And of course, in most attempts to establish truth and reconciliation, like a TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I've often felt that the crucial step of accountability is missing. It's not just enough to find out the truth of what happened to your child or to you, but how are people going to be held accountable for it? And that's where I think we need to really investigate and invest in things like restorative and transformative justice as evolving practices beyond the prison industrial complex. But you can't really get to any justice or reparation of the harm if you're waiting for the person who harmed you to make an apology or anything. And so Mr. Singleton talks about forgiveness as actually an act of radical love, and he offers it as a victim of extreme harm as a statement of his dignity. He wasn't about forsaking accountability, but he refused to let Dylan Roof permanently define who he was. And so he feels, Mr. Singleton feels, that it's about keeping their own power to bestow grace upon someone else. And I think it is a testament to his courage and humanity, and it's a strength-based approach to conflict and harm reduction because it values the humanity of all the people concerned. And so if you want to practice forgiveness as a practice, you have to realize that it's something you do for yourself, it's not for others. You need to let go of emotional baggage, and you really sometimes even question the assumption that something bad happened, because sometimes people will say words that they didn't mean anything bad by them, and sometimes they do. You have to be able to do that kind of threat assessment, and you can forgive people without agreeing with them or condemning them. And it starts with understanding your capacity for handling other people's mistakes and understanding when is that most tested in you. And I think you really need to examine again also how well holding grudges works for you and how much you're weaponizing your status and your identity as a victim and survivor in the circles in which you're doing a lot of calling out. And when our values don't align with our behaviors, what does that say about us? How can people see themselves as interiorly good people while they practice bad behaviors? It's not only a question we need to ask on the right, but we need to ask that question on the left as well and understand what it means to take to forgive, to be an ally. And there's no absolute right or wrong in most situations, even if they appear unforgivable. So I've got some more PowerPoints, but I think I'm going to stop here because there's too little time left. We've only got a few minutes left. So I'm going to stop the share and see if we can get to some of the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Loretta. I've been charged with reading a couple questions to you, and just there's quite a few in here. I don't think we'll get to all of them, but a really interesting question that's been raised is, what do you see as the role of boundaries in alternatives to call out culture?
I think setting boundaries is really good for people. And establishing boundaries is really good for people. And enforcing your boundaries is also really good. But it's a question of how you set them. Again, it's not what you do, but how you do it.
Mhm.
And so when I was growing up with a traumatized mother, for example, who herself was an incest victim, I had to learn how to set boundaries to how her pain affected my pain so that we could grow together as mother and daughter and not constantly inflict our pain on each other. Because we have multiple generations of incest in my family. So it was really important to even learn as a child, and particularly in my 20s, about setting strong boundaries with my mom so that we could actually develop good relationship with each other. And I knew I was going to change before she did, and that was true. So boundaries are really good. You shouldn't let people take advantage of you. Just because you offer people grace or forgiveness, it doesn't mean that they're capable of accepting it. Calling in is an offering. It's not a promise that the person is ready to learn and accept the grace and forgiveness that you're offering them. So you're not doing it for them anyway, you're doing it for yourself. And so that's why boundaries are so important for me. I love to be in relationship with people who stay within the boundaries that are necessary so that I can be in a voluntary versus an involuntary relationship with them.
Okay, thank you. This was an early question. With white women voting again for Trump by 55% and many waning in their support for Black Lives Matter, even within 2 months of the murder of George Floyd, how do we as white women keep our sisters engaged without constantly feeling like we are disengaging due to privilege, fear, white fragility, etc.?
That is a complicated question, which I'm going to try to do justice to. But I really invite people to join my white supremacy class that starts in 15 minutes, where I'm going to be talking about these things. First of all, yes, 55% of white women voted for Trump, but 45% didn't. And so we're going to find our best work done around building the power and consolidating that 45%. And then we can work in proximity and with adjacencies around the people that we can reach within our families, within our communities, within our neighborhoods. But the goal is not try to convert the 55%. My goal is to reduce them to 25% and overwhelm them with our power. And so I'm going to work with the evangelical Christians if I can walk across a platform of faith to talk to them in a different way. I'm going to work with people in my daddy's American Legion or VFW chapter if I can walk, on Veterans Day across a platform of being a military family. There are many ways you can work with people if you pay attention to their heart and not their words sometimes, because people's words don't often, or their voting practices don't actually match what's in their hearts. So we have to talk about shared values in order to start working with people who have such divergent political behavior from us. I think that there are racists and fascists in the Trump movement, but not all, not even the majority. And there are opportunities if we keep the scorn and the sneering off of our face as we try to reach them through letting our desire to call them out subside.
Thank you. Here's a helpful question. How might we create more spaces and collectivities to call people into?
I wish I had time to go into my book, but one of the things that I find that I've started working on is calling in guidelines where you set the rules for how people are going to be together. And so when you try to create a culture shift, like calling in, it's going to be as laborious as what we had to do when we created a culture shift around people wearing seatbelts. When you first said it, everybody was up in arms. Oh, you're taking away my freedoms. You're, whatever. And then, but with a combination of movement work, legal work, culture shift work, artistic work, I mean, we just did it all. And then within my lifetime, we made seatbelting, like smoking, a culture shift. And I think we can make calling out a culture shift, just like we could end violence against women as a culture shift. And our problem is that our event horizon is usually too short. We think just because we have right on our side that it should happen tomorrow. And that's what I thought when I was 16 years old and just getting into the movement. And 50 years later, guess what? I'm still working on the same issues. So, yeah, but I do now better understand what it takes to change hearts and minds. It's a lot more complicated than logic and reason.
I think you've already spoken to this, but it's an interesting question. And so I want to come back to it. You clarified that it's not always a bad idea to call out, okay? In our current national politics, we see half of the political electorate refusing to participate in civic norms. What does calling in look like in this extreme environment where people like Mitch McConnell are making choices to consolidate power while undermining democracy?
Well, let's be honest. I'm not trying to call in Mitch McConnell. I've got another way of dealing with Mitch McConnell, but it's not about calling him in. But I think that a lot of people who support him are being manipulated by their pain, by the false blandishments of a charlatan who's willing to use them and dispose of them while he blocks them getting health care, getting jobs, getting all the things that they actually need. I love this book by a man named Jonathan Metzl, Dying of Whiteness, where he writes about how through these false appeals of the Peter Pans, like the Pied Pipers, like Mitch McConnell, that white folks are being encouraged to constantly act against their own interests to serve this false god of white supremacy. And we really need to interrogate that. I actually feel a lot more sympathy for him than I do anger. But then I'm not white. I mean, and so I'm very happy that white solidarity has been cleaved in half, because that didn't happen in my parents' lifetime. It didn't happen in my grandparents' lifetime. So I'm privileged to be alive when there's really a sufficiently large base of white folks to work with, which did not exist before. And so I'm not the 55 percenters, they actually have a job that they can't do anyway. They're trying to roll time back to the 19th century. And time is really stubborn that way. It only moves forward. It doesn't move backwards just because you want it to. And so that's one of the reasons I believe in the inevitability of our victory, because they literally can't control time. They can't even control themselves.
Okay. We've had a few people ask the question, how do they join your class? Is that a real offer?
That's a real offer. While I answer the last few questions, I will search and put the link on in the chat room. Just give me a
Oh,
second.
actually, I see that Natalia has done that.
Natalia has done that. All right. See, I have an assistant, a wonderful assistant named Natalia, and she's already done that. Yes, starts at 7 o'clock. But if you register for the class and you can't stay tonight, it's only $5 a class. And if you can't stay and you pay the registration, you get access to all the recordings, to every recording you paid for $5. So.
And we will be promoting that class. That sounds like a very important, powerful class. I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions, and there are more than two questions left. But how do we bridge the gap when the information people are exposed to on social media, the news, and then the people they surround themselves with seem to polarize us even more?
Well, psychologists have already done a lot of work of saying that people trust the information best from people they have relationships with. That's how voting behaviors are determined. That's how social behaviors are determined and all that. And so I think we've got to do a lot of relationship building, which we can't do when we have such contempt for the politics with the people we need to build relationships with. And really, it starts many times with our families. I come from a very conservative family, and if you imagine it's hard to talk about Trump politics in a family, try to talk about childhood sexual incest that's multi-generational in a family. So we've had to work on this very intentionally, not always successfully, but we make a commitment to stay in relationship with each other, even as we disagree. And I've been able to make some incremental changes, perhaps larger than I can see, within my family around politics, around behaviors, around sexuality. I remember when my first nephew came out as gay, 40, 50 years ago, and the reaction of the family to that and how that's changed. I mean, the changes don't happen as fast as we'd like them to, but they do happen, particularly if you use a bridge of love to help them along.
Okay.
Do you think you have time for one more, or should we close it out? What do you think?
It's 6:53. I got time for one more.
Okay. Do you see a difference between anger and hatred? And could you speak to that? Audre Lorde discusses that anger, not hatred, can be transformed into action. Is calling out appropriate in this case if it comes along with forgivability?
Well, the two words that I juxtapose against each other are usually anger and outrage. Anger is an internal facing emotion that I actually tend to turn inwardly. Outrage, I turn outwardly. So I get angry at myself and I get outraged at others, kind of thing. That's how I work with it. And what was the other word you offered? Because my mind went, what was the other word? Anger and what?
Hatred.
Hatred is such a consumptive emotion. I don't see why anybody would indulge in it as a long-term strategy, because it's like a cancer eating up your soul from inside. And you walk around living a very miserable shell of a life if you entertain that much hatred in your heart. And so I advise people to let it go. You can be outraged at things, but hating things and hating people is just too much work. And it's too self-destructive. So I can't imagine why people would voluntarily, I'm sorry, let me turn my alarm off, reminding me to shut up. Why people would voluntarily embrace hatred as a virtue or a value. Now, of course, we're looking at 70% of people who voted for Donald Trump who have been taught that hatred is good because we're the evil Satanists trying to lead America to the devil and to the world of pedophilia and all the things, hateful things they've been told about us. But just because they're vulnerable to that type of propaganda doesn't mean we need to treat them the same way, and recognize that we've just got some work to do and we've got to work harder. But if we let our radical love and our honesty and truth shine forward, and if we value their pain as much as we value our own, we actually can make some headway. I have the most astonishing conversations with people. But like I said, I learned that I couldn't even hate the Klan. And when you can't hate the Klan, the hate list is really short.
Sure, that's true. And I just want to, I know you're going to have to hop off in a minute. So I just want to, somebody here said it well. Thank you for the generosity of your time and wisdom. And I think one thing that comes across with you is this radical love concept. And I just think we need more of that. I mean, just being in your presence, I think it's given me something that I'm going to take from here and hold on to it. And thank you for that message. It's not always a popular message. I'm sure you get a lot of pushback, and thank you for all you do and for coming to join us. And I've got a few final announcements, but I wanted to get those thanks in case you have
Can I sign off so that I can switch to my class now?
Yes,
I'm
yes.
sorry, 10 presentations a week is my average. And so it's like planes landing at an airport. Bye-bye.
No problem at all. Thank you again. And thanks to all of you for coming. I just wanted to close us out and say, gosh, it's been, again, an honor working with you, working with Loretta, working with Andrea, Natalio, thank you. All the students, all the campus and community. Thank you so much. The reminder I have is to please register for the morning panel. You can hear more wisdom from Loretta Ross, who will be offering the closing commentary to the topic of reproductive justice is racial justice. That link will be coming across in the images you're going to see in a moment. And please, on your way out, please give to SisterSong if you